in 1940. I was 9 years old.
Okay. So I guess you'd be old enough to remember some things about your father then.
Well, I was 9 years old, but for 2 years before that, we had not seen our father because I got sick in England with rheumatoid arthritis, and I was advised to return. My mother was advised to take me back to Jamaica, otherwise I'd become permanently crippled. And she did this, and so that we left England in 1937, and I did not see my father. Actually, early in 1938, I think it was, and we did not see our father after that. So that my recollections of my father are really those of a 7-year-old. And my brother's 3 years younger than I am, so he was only 4 years old. So.
What type of things do you remember about not only your father, but the whole movement surrounding your father also? I mean, as the son of Marcus Garvey, living in England also for a small period in the United
Well,
States.
what I remember is that we lived in England and in South Kensington. I remember that. We were at actually 53 Talgarth Road. So it sticks in my mind. And there was an office at number 2 Beaumont Crescent. So you see, you do have memories as a child. But the thing that I remembered of my father is his, first of all, his massive dignity. Marcus Garvey was a very dignified and very powerful man. And as a child, that came over very strongly. He was also always well-dressed. I never saw my father any time around the house looking sloppy or casual the way, even I operate.
Even in the house.
Even now, you know what I mean? He was always well dressed and never did look casual. He got up in the morning, he was dressed. Then he came to the table, that sort of thing. And in the house of Marcus Garvey, you were surrounded by books. So my brother and I, we took to reading books at a very early stage. And this set us on our path. My brother is a medical doctor. Actually, he's a surgeon. His specialty is thoracic surgery. That's the chest. He has done quite a bit of work in that field. And we can attribute that to our early growth into reading and books. We had encyclopedias when we were very young, and we just couldn't help reading because my father had this massive library. You had every kind of books. Then you went over to the office, and there were always books and magazines being shipped out all over the world, and everything was so busy. It was a very busy place. So those are the impressions you got. I never heard, as a child, I don't remember going to meetings where he spoke. I may have been, but I don't remember that. But it's the powerful presence. But although you know the presence is powerful, at home he did not impart that, shall we say, that booming voice and so on, which we understand from all the people who heard him. He spoke quietly, but everything was, it's a command, forceful and strong.
At the period in time you're talking about when you were in England before you went back to Jamaica, that's sort of about what stage of the UNIA and the entire movement. I know that's long after Marcus Garvey had been deported from the United States. At what period, what kind of, at what stage was UNIA at that point?
Well, this was the time. It's a very interesting question that you put there. This was the time after the big break of the 1929 convention. 1929 convention occurred just before I was born. But in that convention, there was a breakaway group that was formed, an American group, which broke away from the UNIA, of the leadership of Marcus Garvey. And if you notice, the organization today is called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League 1929 of the world. This means that we are in the direct line of succession from Marcus Garvey. That group that was formed, that split off, and it is pretty clear that their actions were encouraged by the United States government and by the other governments of the time. They were busy robbing the assets of the real UNIA. And it was a battle over assets. The question of the Isaiah Morta estate in Belize came up. So it was a pillaging of the resources of the UNIA, and essentially what the break-off was for that purpose. And that, as to what has happened since, it's it shows the correctness of the view that I'm expressing here, that there was no good purpose for this break, because we are in existence today in the direct line of succession from Marcus Garvey, and we are doing the work. The people who did break off, they do not exist, and they did not exist very long after that. Now, at the time in the 1930s, the UNIA was much reduced. But when you say in the 1930s the UNIA was much reduced, it was still a massive organization. And I'm now talking about the legitimate UNIA in the 1930s. I have had access to documentation on conventions held right here in Canada in 1937. And here's the amazing thing, is that there were 6 divisions represented here in Canada from Costa Rica, one country in Central America. So you must realize that at that time, the UNIA was much weakened, but it was still a massive organization and still the largest organization of African peoples in the world. With all that they attribute other organizations to having taken over the followers of the UNI and ACL. That was not true at the time. The UNI and ACL still continued as a viable and powerful organization up until the time of the death of Marcus Garvey.
Okay. Not like I want to sort of quantify UNI in terms of numbers and membership and that.
Yeah.
But at one point, the UNI had a following around the world.
Yes.
I mean, parts of Asia, parts of Africa, parts of Europe, as well as North America and Central America. By about 1940, we're talking about, well, prior to his deportation, we're talking about millions of followers. What sort of rough estimates or figures? I mean, not to suggest that that's an indication of how many people actually supported him.
Well, if you look at the situation where I mentioned Costa Rica, there were 6 divisions of the UNIA. Well, in Costa Rica, in the best days, I don't think you had more than 12 or 15 divisions. So the decline in the UNIA, as I'm saying, was significant, particularly in the United States. But the UNIA existed all around the world. And this is what people don't seem to realize. They, of course, focus on the United States because most of the work has been done in the United States by American writers. And there is a vested interest in the people who are writing about the UNIA in trying to deprecate the work of Marcus Garvey, because most of the people who have been writing about the UNIA are integrationists who do not have any regard for African nationalism. Their philosophy is completely different from our own. But I cannot quantify the membership of the UNIA in 1937 or 38. I have no means of doing that. But I can say from the number of divisions that were operating then, it was still a very large organization. And even if you go back to the 20s, you could not quantify the total membership of the UNIA. Marcus Garvey gave us figures of around 6 million, but there are other people who say it went up as far as 11 million. The reason is that the UNIA was banned in much of colonial Africa. by the white man.
So you have many followers that
It had many followers, but they could not establish formal divisions, but they were in communication with Marcus Garvey. So when you get numbers of the formal divisions of the UNIA and you get 6 million, it was a lot more. Remember that for instance, in the Belgian Congo and in Portuguese Africa, well, in Portuguese Africa, you were imprisoned for reading the Negro World. But in the Belgian Congo, it was a death penalty for reading the Negro World. So you have to understand the degree of repression that was there. So that Marcus Garvey's organization was always bigger than it was numerically supposed to do by those researchers who go and dig up divisions and so on. And it was massive. I mean, I was recently in Philadelphia meeting an old timer who told us about the days in the 1920s when Marcus Garvey's movement was in full swing in Philadelphia, talking about 1921, 22. Now, we all know about the size of the New York division, which was over 40,000. But the Philadelphia division was some 25,000. I mean, you're talking about massive, massive units that you don't have anything like that anywhere in the world today, in the sense of a formal organization of African people, as a matter of fact, in the sense of a formal organization of any people.
it's also true that, you know, numbers aren't always an indication of what kind of support you have, because even in South Africa you had, I mean, some of the early members of the ANC would follow the Negro world and Marcus Garvey's messages, and